Alright, we're in the random spare room because the neighbours are going off with all the damn renovations and the bloody birds keep chirping and the weather's turned to crap, so the whole world's against me and that's why we're in here. Now, a couple of videos ago I discussed the differences between an enduro bike, a dual sport and an adventure bike, and in this video I wanted to address the 4 common mistakes I see people making when they're getting their first off-road motorcycle and trying to choose between each of these categories. So I'm going to go through each category again to recap for the beginner riders out there. Then I'm going to kind of go over who I think which category is suited best for, and then we're going to discuss the 4 common mistakes that I see people making. I've made most of these mistakes myself when I was first starting out, so I learned the hard way, and I thought I'd make this video to try and save some people some time so they don't have to make these mistakes themselves, maybe save yourself some money or some hardship in the future. So let's get into the video. What exactly is an enduro bike? Well, it's a bike that you can buy on Saturday and race on Sunday in an endurance race. Now in America, you tend to call these bikes plated dirt bikes or even dual sports. But here in Australia, and I'm sure some other countries, we refer to what the manufacturers call enduro bikes as enduro bikes. So those are bikes that you can see raced in endurance off-road races, like Red Bull's Romaniacs, for instance. So they're bikes that you can purchase on a Saturday and race on a Sunday. And KTM has that great caption that they say their bikes are ready to race. And that's exactly what an enduro bike is. It's extremely dirt focused and very high quality. And there are a few features about the enduro bike that really set it apart from the other categories. So what are the defining characteristics of an enduro bike? Well, they're the lightest weight of all the categories. They have the highest dirt performance. They also have the highest maintenance because they are so high performance. So oil changes and valve checks are measured in hours rather than kilometers because of the frequency of having to service these bikes. They're not unreliable, they can be very dependable motorcycles, but because of how high performance they are, they do require a lot more upkeep than the other categories. They also have the most high-end components, so you can expect the best suspension for off-road use on these bikes, as well as other things like nice aftermarket handlebars and all high-end, lightweight, strong components, all in service of making this the lightest, most dirt-focused bike that you can get. They're also defined by only having a single cylinder engine, and you can get these in 4-stroke and 2-stroke variants. So that's another defining feature of the Enduro. And as you can see in the diagram there, you can see some examples of Enduro bikes. So the obvious one is KTM's EXC range. They're hugely popular for good reasons. Also, you've got Yamaha's WR450F and 250F, another great bunch of bikes there. And I've also got, closer to the dual sports, Honda's CRF 450L. Now it's closer to the dual sports because Honda have tried to focus on making the CRF 450L a little better on the road than other enduro offerings. It also has a stronger rear subframe, so it can carry a little bit more luggage. So it's had some touches to it to make it a little nicer on the road. So the next category we have is the dual sport. Now that's characterized by its name. It's a dual purpose motorcycle. So this is a motorcycle that, unlike the enduro bike, it has been designed for off-road and on-road in about a 50-50 split, although that changes depending on what dual sport you get. Bikes like the Yamaha WR250R and the DRZ 400 are much closer to an enduro bike, whereas bikes like a DR650 or a KLR 650, they're getting a little closer to the adventure bike. So it's a very widespread and it's a quite nuanced category. But a dual sport is defined by a few major factors. It has low maintenance, it's durable, it's focused on longevity of the motorcycle. That is, it can survive a lot of punishment and last a long time. Dual sports are also focused on value for money. So you're not going to get as high-end components as you would on an enduro bike. And that's where you start to see the differences. They're not as capable off-road because the components tend to be a little lower spec. They also only have single cylinder motors like the Enduro bike, except they're in a lot lower state of tune. So the engine isn't as stressed and isn't trying to make as much power. So that's where they get the durability from. Because the motors aren't stressed out, they can last a lot longer and require a lot less maintenance, but you do sacrifice performance and in some instances weight as well. Dual sports are also reasonably light. They're far lighter than an adventure bike, but they are a little bit heavier than an enduro bike. Now, you might not think that, say, 20 or 50 kilos is much difference between an enduro bike and a dual sport, but if you're doing very technical riding and it's quite warm weather and you're getting stuck and having to pick up your bike a lot, that 20 or 50 kilos really makes a massive difference. And that's why you find enduro riders and racers, every kilo counts, every gram in fact counts sometimes, all in servicing you being able to maintain your stamina. So the lighter the bike, the better for an enduro bike. Whereas a dual sport, you're not pushing it so hard, so weight isn't such a major factor, but it still is a major plus. So they will be fairly light and nowhere near as heavy as an adventure bike, but still a little porkier than your average enduro motorcycle. So adventure bikes is the next category, and this is the hardest category to define, purely because adventure is subjective and it's also quite a marketing term. So it's used to describe a large array of motorcycles rather than a defining characteristic like enduro bikes being made specifically for endurance races and dual sports being made for dual purpose, that is 50-50 split of on-road, off-road. Adventure bikes are termed such because you can have adventures on them. So that really depends on the kind of person you are. You can take a cruiser and go on a camping trip and have an adventure, and therefore you could try and term it as an adventure bike. So it really does depend on how you define the term, but I think there are some real instances that define an adventure bike and allow you to categorize it as such. Now, an adventure bike to me has to be capable of doing some off-road riding. It almost always has 2 cylinders or more. I say almost always because there are a few with single cylinders, but mostly you find 2 or more cylinders. They have lots of electronics, so you can expect traction control, ABS, cruise control, heated grips, often Bluetooth connectivity for your headset with the dash, lots of fancy electronics like that. They also have the biggest engine sizes of all 3 categories. They're also the heaviest because of all those features. They're going to be the most stable and the most comfortable on the road. They're also going to be the most road focused of the bunch. They're the best for taking large amounts of luggage, and they're also the best for taking a pillion passenger. They're also the only bike in all 3 categories to have options of both spoke and alloy wheels. Now, alloy wheels aren't as good off-road, but they're a little bit better than spoke wheels on the road. So that's why you see them cropping up on adventure bikes. So that's some of the defining characteristics of what makes an adventure bike. It needs to be able to do some off-road, but its focus is mostly on long distance touring and adventure riding. So having ridden off-road for quite some time, I'm no expert, but I've met a lot of people and I've watched a lot of people make decisions. I've had many bikes myself. So I thought I'd offer what mistakes I see commonly made when people choose a particular category for themselves. Now, one of the major mistakes I have made, and I've seen lots of others make, is assuming that an enduro is the best suited motorcycle for anyone wanting to do the most amount of off-road riding. And I found this out the hard way. I had dreams of owning an enduro bike, and I started testing some of them off-road and comparing them to my WR250R. And what I quickly discovered is that an enduro bike obviously requires a lot more mental focus and mental stamina and physical ability and physical endurance to be able to ride those motorcycles. You need a lot more input. You need to concentrate a whole lot more to be able to get the most out of those bikes. And therefore, they're a lot more physically taxing to ride, more mentally taxing to ride, because you have to have your mental and physical focus at 100% to get the most out of these bikes. So I actually discovered that for my kind of riding, where I'm riding from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. off-road and I'm doing 300 plus kilometers in the dirt, for me, a dual sport is much better because it allows me to maintain my stamina through that long day. So I found that out the hard way riding bikes like the WR450F, the WR250F, and the CRF 450L. They required a lot more input and they wore me out far quicker than my dual sport. So keep that in mind. If you're a guy that maybe has a few physical injuries, maybe you're not the fittest, or you're just new to off-road riding, perhaps start with a dual sport and see how you go, and then get something more dirt focused after a while of riding, because they do require a lot of physical and mental input to be able to ride well. The other mistake I see made often is the guy who's got dirt experience and has had a long break. Perhaps the kids have finally left and now you've got a little more time on the weekends. So rather than getting an enduro bike, you get a dual sport or an adventure bike. And I've seen this happen a few times, and they quickly realize that these bikes are too heavy and the suspension isn't quite there and the power just isn't enough to keep you satisfied. And the kind of riding you're doing where you're trailering your bike and you're only doing a half day of very hard riding and coming home and spending the other half of the day with the wife or relaxing, that is the kind of scenario where I really think an enduro bike is the best kind of bike for you. The guy who really likes to push it, but you're perhaps not doing a 10-hour day in the saddle or multi-day trips. You're just really focusing on the single track and really having fun for, say, half a day, maybe a full day every now and then, and maybe a small one-day camping trip once in a blue moon. And you've got that dirt skill set and you've got the bank account because the kids are finally left and you finally have some money for yourself. So I think that is a category where you should really maybe look at some enduro bikes, because there are some great ones out there that do complement the returning dirt rider. The third mistake is also one that I'm quite guilty of making, and that's getting the adventure bike as your first off-road motorcycle. Now, the reasons I did this was because I was coming from a road background. I actually had a super sport. I was quite into my track days, getting my knee down, dressing like a Power Ranger on the weekends. And then I started shifting to thinking, hey, maybe this dirt riding would be a lot of fun. Rather than getting a more dirt focused motorcycle like a dual sport, I went and got an adventure bike. And I did this because this was the most familiar kind of motorcycle to me. It looked the most like a road motorcycle, what I was familiar with. It had a fairing, the wheels looked the same as the bike I rode, that is that they had cast alloy wheels. They had all the safety features that I wanted and the most amount of comfort that I'd come to expect out of road motorcycles. But when I got to the off-road, I quickly found that I just did not have the skills to handle such a large and heavy motorcycle off-road. It's a completely different ball game. If you have never ridden off-road before, please do not start out on an adventure bike, as you will find it too heavy and too cumbersome. Now, not everyone will fit in that category, but I think most people will be better served with either a dual sport or an enduro as their first off-road motorcycle, unless you really aren't pushing it. If you're only doing very well-maintained dirt roads, then probably an adventure bike is going to be just fine. But for me, where I wanted to take my bike down some more technical terrain, I quickly found out that I just couldn't handle with my very basic skill sets an adventure bike straight out of the gate. So I ended up getting a dual sport as well, and I ended up loving it so much more, not worrying about being able to pick up the bike, it being so much lighter. The suspension soaked up the bumps a lot better. I was able to take it far more interesting places and I was far less fatigued. So that's another warning I'll give you. Don't go for an adventure bike just because it's more familiar to you, especially if you're planning on doing lots of dirt riding in the future. The fourth mistake I also see people make is people getting stuck in the categories. I'm quite a fluid kind of person. I like to think of myself as quite open-minded and I really try and understand lots of different perspectives. But I do see a lot of people that get in their little camps and everybody likes to throw rocks at each other. But an adventure bike particularly, if you're wanting a bike to do long distance adventure touring, and you're not really wanting to do any dirt roads, that is, you just want to take camping gear and go and see the sights, and you're going to do almost exclusively road riding, then perhaps don't think only of an adventure bike. You don't need the bike that looks like an off-road motorcycle to go and have adventures. And in fact, I've discovered this myself over time. I don't actually own an adventure bike at the moment, even though I could. I own a cruiser purely because I like the engine characteristics. It's great for long distance riding. It can take my camping gear, and it can also take a pillion very comfortably. But because it doesn't have the adventure bike name, it also doesn't have the price tag that comes with it. Adventure bikes can be a real marketing strategy, and I've noticed particularly in the second-hand market that adventure bikes can carry quite a premium over, say, a second-hand street bike, cruiser, or even a sport tourer. So don't get stuck in thinking you need an adventure bike if you're going to be doing mostly road riding. Maybe think outside the box and look at different categories and save yourself a bit of money. I know that I had a bit of a win doing that lately, and it's one of the major factors I didn't choose an adventure bike, because all the adventure bikes secondhand for me were too expensive and they had far higher kilometers than the street bikes I was looking at. And really, this scenario suits the person who already has a dual sport or an enduro bike. If you've got that bike to satisfy the dirt side of riding and the dirt focused adventure trips, then you really don't need a dirt focused second motorcycle. If that's you, don't make the mistake of getting stuck in the adventure category and perhaps paying that second hand premium for the adventure bike name. So that's some food for thought. Hopefully that's helped you out there. This really was a video focused more towards the beginners than the seasoned veterans. But if you are a seasoned veteran, as I know plenty of you are, please share your wisdom down below. Don't forget to hit that like button and also subscribe if you haven't already. And as always, guys, I've been Solid, and I'll catch you in the next video. See you later, guys.